The Ghost of Old Abilene, hauntings from the Wild West. The prairie winds sweep across the old cowtown of Abilene, Kansas, carrying with them more than dust. Locals say if you listen close, especially after midnight, you'll hear echoes of voices that shouldn't still exist. Gunshots in the distance, horses screaming, the thundering chaos of a saloon fight. Abilene was once the rowdiest town on the frontier. In the late 1800s, cowboys fresh off cattle drives flooded the streets, bringing money, whiskey, and trouble. Marshals like Wild Bill Hickok walked these same dusty roads, guns at their sides, trying to keep order in a place where order didn't last long. And though the gunfights in the saloons are long gone, people in Abilene whisper that something of those violent nights still lingers. They say the town itself is haunted, not just one building, but the very streets, the very air. Travelers swear they've heard the clatter of spurs following them down empty alleys. Others have seen shadowy men in long dusters standing in the doorways of buildings that haven't been open in 100 years. Men who vanish when approached. But the darkest story is the one few locals will tell aloud. They call it the Ghost of Old Abilene, a restless spirit said to be trapped here since the blood-soaked cattle days. No one agrees on who he was in life. Some say he was a lawman gunned down before he could make his mark. Others claim he was a drifter killed in a backroom poker game, buried without a name. And a few insist he wasn't a man at all, but something darker that fed on the violence of the town until it took shape. What everyone does agree on is this: once you see him, you don't forget him. A tall figure, hat pulled low, eyes burning like dying coals. He drifts along the railroad tracks, through the ruins of saloons, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, right past you, brushing you with a cold so sharp it burns. And sometimes, on the anniversary of certain shootouts, folks claim the entire street comes alive again. A ghostly gunfight plays out in front of witnesses, men falling, pistols firing, and blood pooling on ground that's been dry for over a century. Then, just as suddenly as it begins, the vision is gone, but the smell of gunpowder remains. One of the most unsettling accounts comes from a woman who stayed at a historic inn near the old cattle yards. She awoke one night to the sound of boots pacing outside her room. Slow, deliberate, heavy boots, like a lawman patrolling the halls. At first, she thought it must be another guest, but the pacing went on for hours. When she finally opened her door, she saw nothing. Nothing but an empty hallway lined with portraits of men who died in Abilene over 100 years ago. One photograph in particular caught her eye. A man in a dark duster, face half in shadow, eyes burning with a strange intensity. She swore the man in the portrait looked exactly like the figure she'd seen in her dreams that same night, standing at the foot of her bed, silently watching. When she asked about it the next day, locals only shook their heads. "You must have seen him," one old man told her. "The Ghost of Old Abilene. He doesn't bother folks much, unless you bother him first." Not everyone is so lucky. In 1993, a group of teenagers dared each other to break into one of the abandoned saloons near the train tracks. They carried flashlights and whispered jokes to hide their nerves. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, and the smell of dust and whiskey still clung to the air. On the bar, their light caught a set of deep scratches, as if someone had raked their nails into the wood and left them there decades ago. Then came the sound. A gunshot, not from outside, not from a movie, not from imagination. A sharp crack of a revolver firing right inside the room with them. They dropped their flashlights, plunging themselves into darkness. When one boy finally managed to turn his light back on, he saw a figure leaning against the bar. A man, tall and thin, dressed in black with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His face was hidden, but his chest rose and fell as if he were still alive. The kids bolted, but one swore later that as he ran, a hand brushed his shoulder. ice cold, strong, and deliberate. To this day, he won't go near the old district after dark. Stories like this pile up, hushed confessions from townsfolk, strangers who come to visit, then leave shaken, refusing to ever return. And through them all runs a common thread. The ghost of Old Abilene does not rest. Some believe he's tied to the railroad itself, the iron road that brought violence, gambling, and death to town. On certain nights, people claim to hear a phantom train whistle, but when they rush to the tracks, there is no train. Only the shadow of a man standing where the cattle cars once unloaded, hat brim low, watching, waiting. Others claim the ghost is bound to the saloons, reliving over and over the moments of his violent death. Witnesses have described walking into one of the old dance halls, only to hear a piano playing itself, notes echoing through an empty room. When they step closer, the keys fall silent. The piano sits in the corner, broken, untouched for decades. And then there are the battle sounds. Entire groups of visitors have reported hearing them. Not one person, not two, but dozens at a time. The sound of cowboys yelling, bottles breaking, pistols firing into the night. Yet when the echoes fade, the streets are empty, silent, and cold. Skeptics say it's imagination, old buildings groaning, or tricks of the wind. But believers insist the violence of Abilene's past has been burned into the town like a scar that refuses to fade. And the ghost, he's not just a man, but the embodiment of all that anger, all that death, trapped forever in the streets he once roamed. Perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from a railroad worker in the 1970s. He claimed he was walking the tracks near midnight when he saw a man up ahead, standing perfectly still. Thinking it was a drunk, he called out, warning him to move. But the man didn't move. He didn't even breathe. When the worker walked closer, he saw the man's face, or rather, the lack of one, just a shadow where his features should have been. He turned to run, but the figure was suddenly beside him, whispering words he couldn't understand. Cold air filled his lungs, and for a moment he swore he was drowning. He woke up on the ground hours later, frost clinging to his jacket, though the night had been warm. He quit his job that same week and moved away. To this day, the worker refuses to talk about it. His children say he never set foot in Abilene again. Now, tourists pass through Abilene for its history, its museums, its charm. But every so often, one leaves with a story too strange to explain. A door slamming shut in an empty hallway. A man's shadow stretching across the street when no one is there. The smell of gunpowder on the wind. The ghost of Old Abilene isn't tied to one building. He belongs to the whole town. And if you wander there at night, past midnight with the wind carrying dust across the empty streets, you may hear it for yourself. The gunshot that never ends, the footsteps that never fade, and the low, rattling breath of a man who should have died more than 100 years ago. But he didn't die. Not really. Not in Abilene. Because in Abilene, the past never stays buried.